So we here at Domestique, we run a masterclass series twice a month. We try and pick different topics that we're hearing from customers, prospects, people in the industry. And one of our goals behind these is like, we want to make these super tactical. So our definition of success is hopefully you all are walking away with like, hey, we can come out of this like with things you can kind of do here today. So if you have any questions, one of our big beliefs is in these masterclass series, we'd much rather this be a conversation. So feel free to drop it into the chat or go ahead and kind of raise your hand and we'll kind of call on you along the way. If we don't get to all the questions here today, we're always happy to kind of jump on another session kind of afterwards and kind of just dive further into kind of any specific topic. We also have, if you're curious, a whole list of previous webinars that we've had up on the website. If you go to our website at domestique.info/resources, you can see everything. It's things from outbound to attribution to capacity planning to the latest AI features that HubSpot released. So we're continuing to do this. If you got any questions, happy to kind of answer those questions. Quick intro for all of you. My name is Reese Williams. I'm one of the two co-founders here at Domestique. Domestique, we're a RevOps agency. We got a team of 50 individuals. It's 55 now, I think, and we classify ourselves as a full stack RevOps agency. So market ops, sales ops, CS ops, all the major tech admins, content enablement, all that type of good stuff. I am not the smart person here today, so I'm going to quickly shut up here. We've got a good friend James has been a good friend for a long time. So we're going to do a fireside chat here with James Winter. He is a marketing guru. He's been previous CMO at several different times. So he currently is at Telescope as their kind of head of marketing. So he was the VP of marketing at Brandfolder. He was the director of marketing at Spiral Q and has served as CMO several different times. So the cool part about James's background is because he's at Telescope today and because he's also been a CMO, he is both the operator as well as the kind of like board perspective. James, I didn't do your background justice. You want to give us kind of a little bit further kind of intro about who you are and then give us a fun fact about something you like to do or something like that. And then we'll jump into things.
Yeah, sounds good. Hey everyone, known Domestique for a few years now. They've worked with, I think, over half of our portfolio at this point. So excited to finally give back and meet all of you. I have been in early stage startups for almost my entire career and usually coming in around seed or Series A and building out marketing functions. Over the last 3 years, I've been doing that full time for Telescope. We're an early stage B2B SaaS venture capital firm. We mostly do Series A investing, some follow-on, but I work across a lot of different types of companies, some very horizontal, some vertical, some enterprise, some SMB. So I have a pretty broad purview of sort of what's working and where people go right or wrong, and it keeps things super interesting. So hopefully I can share a little bit of guidance and things that I wish I knew when I was in the operator seat. But feel free to ask questions along the way and follow up with me afterwards if there's anything we didn't get to.
Cool. Well, James, very grateful. And then one quick fun fact about you for the team on the personal front.
I used to do more fun stuff. Now that I'm older and getting married soon and probably having kids, I've put some of that on the back burner. But I got really into paragliding a few years ago and traveled all over with it. So I've gone to fly in Chile and Colombia and Mexico and New Zealand and got very hooked on it. I know some of you are in Colorado, so maybe you've seen some of the folks out on Lookout Mountain or in the Flatirons. But yeah, it's really addicting. If you ever have a chance to go do the tandem flight, I would suggest you take it.
James, you and I spent so much time together. I don't think I knew that. Like that, that's a good one. That's one of the better ones we've heard. So cool. Well, just to give everybody a quick preview about what we're going to chat through today. So we got a handful of key topics that James and I have kind of like teed up advanced. But like I said, if there's areas you want to dive into, please don't hesitate to kind of like ask questions along the way. So we're going to start with kind of an overview about like the difference between, so this whole session today is about marketing, best in class performance metrics, KPIs, things like that. So we're going to talk about that from, the difference from being an operator versus a board perspective of like, what should you think about as an operator and what does your board care about? How do you leverage those kind of reporting dashboards, KPIs to be able to go ahead and make investment decisions? One of the things that, is on everybody's mind today is AI. How do you take existing AI and help that, accelerate, pour gas on the fire of your marketing performance metrics? We're going to also talk about what are the right metrics to track. I know James has seen a bunch. We've seen a bunch of like anything and everything. So trying to kind of align around what is it. And then we're going to start to dive into some like specific things of like, you get into debates around cohorted versus uncohorted. What's the benefits of both? Again, who cares about that? Operators versus boards. We'll talk about some common mistakes, and then we'll kind of talk about like how does all of this kind of live within, RevOps. How do you align kind of RevOps with kind of the marketing performance, so on and so forth. So that's going to be what we're going to kind of cover today. So James, let's go ahead and start kind of at the operator board perspective. I think you truly have one of the most unique backgrounds in the fact that you've sat in both seats, and so you have a good understanding. I'm curious, give us your perspective about, as you're thinking about best-in-class marketing metrics, performance metrics, things like that, what do you look for when you're a CMO and, the operator side? And then when you've also sat in the board meeting, it's a slightly different story. What do you care about there as well?
Yeah, I think the frustrating answer that everyone is probably somewhat expecting is it depends. And it's going to depend on the type of business you're in, the maturity of your category, how competitive pressures are affecting things currently, what your ACVs look like, where things are getting stuck. So I don't want to give a cookie cutter answer because it's not going to be super helpful to folks. And if I tried, it would be relevant for some and irrelevant for others. So I think the underlying theme is the same metrics probably don't matter all the time. And one of the things that, I interview a lot of marketing and RevOps folks for positions in the portfolio. The thing that I seem to miss from candidates about half the time is they just don't seem like business people first. And I think it's really important to not just think about yourself as an operator, whether that's marketing or RevOps or sales. Think about, holistically, what is holding the business back in whatever current state you're in. So quarter by quarter, that could change. If your cash position is super strong, then you might be able to have a higher payback period, or your LTV to CAC and what, rule of 40 looks like for the board in an ideal world might be totally different. So this is where getting close to the CEO and pushing your CEO, if they're not bringing this to you proactively, to say, how is the board and how are you as the CEO thinking about what is most important to us currently? I think if you're broadly speaking about early stage kind of post Series A companies, it's usually about finding some sort of scalable channels to grow the business from 5 to 20 million in ARR. So the typical things that we'll want to see are good LTV to CAC, good rule of 40, good payback period. I tend not to put all that much emphasis on LTV to CAC because you just don't have that much historical data yet. So payback period, if I had to pick kind of one, payback period is usually the thing that I care the most about, because it's going to, especially for the businesses that we invest in, they're usually not big cash burners. So we tend to invest in companies that are looking to grow pretty efficiently. They're not doing a massive raise with a huge valuation that they have to grow into or raise a big down round. So we look for areas where we can put some dollars in, get some dollars back pretty quickly. We don't have to burn a ton of money to get there. And we know that there's some repeatability and scalability to the go-to-market motion.
So James, along those lines, as particularly you think about it from kind of the board perspective, right? When you're going in to invest in a company, how important is it for you from the board perspective where marketing leaders can, whether before you invest or quickly after you invest, can come back to you and be able to tell you in a board meeting, hey, this channel or channels is or is not working, and this is where and how we would invest. Like, how important is that, and what's the kind of level of detail you want to be able to see from kind of like marketing leaders around that kind of conversation?
Again, it depends on the business. So if you're in a more mid-market and above, called out like 40K ACV and up, 60-ish day sales cycles, well-defined TAM, maybe it's vertical software. I think marketing is going to have a much more limited ability to influence growth because there's probably just more efficiency to be had via direct sales and good outbound. So again, annoying answer. It depends on the business. If you're in a high velocity motion where you're spending, $1,000 per qualified opportunity, maybe $5,000 per customer with 5 to 10K ACV, marketing being able to show a scalable channel as quickly as possible is hyper important and probably the thing that will determine whether the business succeeds or fails. If you're selling 6-figure deals with 6 to 12 month sales cycles, marketing is going to be more about field and product marketing and sales enablement and maybe M motions. The time gap between effort or investment and impact is going to be a lot longer. And generally, the highest leverage in investment dollars in your go-to-market motion is going to come more from either partnerships or direct selling motions. So again, it depends. Know the type of business you're in, know what the levers are that are going to make or break it. And ideally, when the investment gets made, there is some hypotheses around that. But that's not always the case at Series A when you don't really know yet. I mean, every investment firm has a different thesis and things that they look for, and some are way more aggressive with deploying cash and higher valuations. So I can't speak for all of them. And again, this is where first principles are just always important here. Know the environment that you're operating in. I'm sorry that this sounds super repetitive, but digging into the why behind what you're doing and how the business is supposed to grow is the best thing you can do.
So along those lines, right? Like digging into the why, like what as you think about kind of like, transitioning that hat from the board hat to kind of the operator hat, right? As you're thinking about kind of like, hey, where and how do we want to make test investment decisions to be able to kind of figure out what's working, what's not working? Like, what are some of the things that you like to do in some of those different scenarios, right? And I think you've done a good job highlighting the fact that it depends on what kind of business you're in. But like, what are some of the things you're thinking about of like testing, hey, okay, this seems to be working. I want to allocate more dollars here, or this isn't working, so I want to redeploy those dollars somewhere else.
There's broadly speaking going to be a constrained number of things that are going to be your highest leverage opportunities depending on your ACV. So if you are a more transactional business with ACVs under 10K, you can't spend 10 to 20K to acquire a customer. So things like AEO and GEO, SEO, paid social if it's not on LinkedIn, which I think Meta has never been more accessible to B2B SaaS than it is now. It's still a very hard channel to pull off, but depending on your category, I think it's still one of the cheapest pipeline sources, and especially like for building brand. If you're more upmarket, you're doing the 6 and 7-figure deals, events, especially in vertical software, especially in health tech, just continue to be super important. We've seen the magical combination of a really tight SDR and sales motion with both conferences and owned events still being one of the best levers. I'm a firm believer that if you have a fairly known TAM, it's never been easier to go map out your entire TAM essentially on a regional basis and figure out like, where can we run, at minimum 10 to 20 dinners a year. The playbook that I really love is like find a Michelin star restaurant in every city that you have a geographic concentration of decision makers in invite 5 to 10 of them, ideally 1 or 2 customers. I have a friend who runs this playbook at a scale of like 90 events per year. And that's basically the only channel they invest in because they sell to Fortune 1000 CEOs, CMOs. And it works incredibly well for them because these people want to talk to each other. You're never going to like get them on a cold call. They're probably not going to events. They're not going to respond to cold email. They're incredibly well networked. So showing up and providing value for them and giving them an offer of like, hey, come to this sick restaurant that maybe you'd only go to on your anniversary. It only costs you as a business like $5,000. So if you generate, 100K in pipeline from that, the numbers actually work really well. They've gone to this extreme where their entire SDR team only is responsible for generating attendance for these events because the conversion rate from dinner attended to qualified opportunity is way higher than it is if they're just doing cold outreach. And then we have, a portfolio company that is in a category where they have 1 million searches for a bottom of funnel keyword per month. And so SEO is inherently basically the only way to make that work because the ACVs are pretty low and it's a fairly commoditized space. But the numbers 1 through 3 organic position on Google are worth honestly tens of millions of dollars. They have seen just a dramatic change in the business when it flexes between position 3 and 4. So yeah, still think about what can and model it out. Like it's never been easier with Claude Code, which we'll talk about later, but like if you're not super quantitatively oriented, do some scenario forecasting, run some Monte Carlo simulations in Claude Code, figure out sort of based on what your ACV and win rates look like, which channel you can afford to spend on. And then, sorry, the one other thing I'll say, ground all of this in qualitative research up front. Just go talk to as many customers or prospects in your first whatever time period and just try to figure out where they seek out information. Because they might tell you, oh, we go to these 2 events every year. It's where we find half of our vendors. We go there specifically to seek information on new technology partners. And if that's not on your radar, it has to be.
In one note that James brought up that we run into this issue all the time here. James talked about the TAM. One thing that we see with a lot of customers, they actually don't have their TAM in their CRM today. That is like low hanging, easy for like, to James' point, go do the ICP and analysis, figure out who the right, companies are, who are the right personas, things like that. There's all sorts of enrichment tools. Get that TAM into your CRM because that's your starting point. And like the number of companies we see who don't even have 20% of their TAM in their CRM, like it's my mind because you can't do anything else if you don't have that as a starting point. So.
And not to go down that big rabbit hole, but don't be satisfied. And maybe this is advice that nobody needs to hear in 2026 because I'm sure everyone's heard of Clay or played around with it, but don't be satisfied with whatever enrichment provider you're locked in with. If you're using ZoomInfo and there's other I'm going to call them features from a data science perspective. Don't be satisfied with just whatever firmographic segmentation your enrichment provider has built because there might be more subtle things that AI has now made it very easy for you to enrich with. So I used to pay, thousands of dollars a month to offshore teams in the Philippines or in Pakistan to go do manual pre-qualification of TAM builds. And for example, is this a men's fashion brand? Is it a women's fashion brand? Is it high-end fashion? Is it low-end fashion? Is it direct to consumer? Is it retail? Like those are all things that had a meaningful impact on how we did outreach and segmented. But now you can use third-party APIs. For those of you who haven't, spent a lot of time researching AI, there are things called embeddings where you create a database of essentially what the features and like just more deeper description of each company is. And you can have Claude Code use the OpenAI embeddings API to go and research your entire TAM list and extract specific commonalities, ideally that maybe are different between your most frequent closed won and closed lost regions. And this is stuff that before you would have had to have a really kick-ass data scientist to go run models on, or a really good RevOps or data analyst. And now it's pretty easy to have Claude Code write you some Python scripts to go execute this.
So James, this is a great kind of like pivot point, right? We started to touch on some of the AI tools, right? We talked about a little about Clay. We talked about Claude Code. If you were a CMO, and let's say best in case, you're starting with a, fresh tech stack, right? You can kind of design it however you want to design it. What would be the tools that you would design to be able to kind of do some of the key things you needed to do as an operator, right? Get your TAM into your CRM, understand your kind of segmentation, be able to kind of write automation. What would that look like, particularly from an AI? And then what are 1 or 2 or 3 AI hacks you're using today that you love?
Before we get there, because I want to make sure people hear this before people might have to drop early. Sorry to hijack your agenda, Reese, but
no. Let's do this.
There are 3 things I want everyone to kind of take away from just the board relationship perspective. The number one thing that will put you in a deep hole is being defensive in board meetings or with the investors. So do your best to be sort of a dispassionate analyst or observer about the metrics. If there needs to be finger pointing, do it in private in the weeks leading up to the board meeting and make sure you guys all have a tight narrative around what is going to be said. It is such a red flag if we see the leadership team kind of like being defensive, pointing fingers at each other in the board meeting. So like be the dispassionate observer as much as possible. The second one, which kind of goes along with that, but just like know the numbers in the narrative. The point is not to just read out the numbers. Board meetings should never just be a readout of the numbers, but we all want to see why you think they are what they are, what you're going to do about it, how it's informing hiring and investments and everything that you're doing with that data. And then the last thing is like be aware of what is a strategic priority for the CEO and the board. In every board meeting, there's usually a couple of strategic topics that take up most of the time. And you need to be aware of those because it might mean you like if marketing or RevOps or GTM is not the biggest priority that quarter, you might save yourself a bunch of time doing crazy decks and reporting build outs because nobody really cares that quarter. Now, if the numbers look terrible, then that's probably not going to be the case. But if you're sort of like performing to plan and, hiring is a big priority or big product stuff or CS stuff, like whatever it might be, know going in what the strategic conversation is about so that you can prepare accordingly.
And to James' point that he's making here, I want to just kind of double click on a couple things he said. In most best-in-class board meetings, we typically see 2 decks. One is the deck that's set ahead of time that has all the additional context, and that's your kind of readout, what somebody can read out on plane, right? We call it the plane deck. But, back when board members used to travel on planes. And the second, some people do. Some people do. James does. The second is that presentation deck. And to James's point, in that presentation, you may or may not have a much readout, and it shouldn't just be a regurgitation of the numbers. It's what's going on, why do you think that's the case, and then what are we doing about that, right? The 3 layers of critical thinking. We've got some board decks on our site that we worked with James and some other kind of VCs about like standardized board decks. But again, to James's comment here, you need to kind of think about the type of business you're in because some of the metrics will change and things like that. But thinking about those 2 things very differently. James, anything else before we move off the board topic that is important either as an operator coming into the board meeting or something you as a board member want to see from the operator?
Yeah, I think the biggest mistake I used to make was sending way too much data. And I still think that's important, but put it in the appendix most of the time, make it a little bit tighter in the main body of the board deck. That being said, what I really like to see, and Reese, I don't know if we're going to share the screen of like the reporting template, but we love it when we have some sort of self-service analytics opportunity within a portco. On the extreme end, We've seen portcos hook up a Slack bot into Snowflake where everything is a unified view in their warehouse. A Slack bot powered by Claude allows us to say, like, pull the cohort data from May 2025 to January 2026 and tell us if there's a correlation between new user signups and team plan signups or whatever. On the sort of more straightforward side, I'm a huge fan of the tool called coefficient.io. It's incredibly cheap if you're not trying to hook it up to a bunch of different tools, but it's essentially a pre-built connector for everything in like a typical Series A tech stack. So everything from like HubSpot, Salesforce, Google Analytics, Google Paid Ads, LinkedIn, Meta, QuickBooks even. If you just set up a few recurring reports, hook those up to Coefficient, populate a sheet that gets refreshed on a daily basis, and put together a spreadsheet like this. We have some of our portcos basically build out a sheet like this and share it with us. And it's super helpful because it saves time on both of our ends. So if you put your slides together for the board meeting, you build your narrative around it, you can skip a lot of reporting that you would have otherwise have to do if you just add a link to this sheet so that if we want to go look up something else, we can go do it pretty quickly.
And the cool part to James's comment is most board members don't fly at the level of detail that James does. Most board members are flying a more 60,000 foot level, right? But if you have this data, they then kind of trust you on an ongoing basis because you're looking at the same data on a time over time. But in the scenarios, then when you get somebody who's got as detailed background as James does, you can dive down into the details because this is how you're running the business on a day-to-day.
Go ahead. The other thing I'd say there is most investors may not be at this level of detail all the time, but it's almost a guarantee that at some point they will want to dig into the detail here. And these are all people who spend 80% of their day in spreadsheets. So like, don't be afraid of giving them numbers to manipulate. It's not, I wouldn't just take a screenshot of this and put it in the deck, but I think it's very helpful to have on hand for when questions arise.
And one comment about this is something that, James has put together. We work with a lot of our customers about like, hey, when they're coming in asking about questions about best in class, there is a fair amount of, not a fair amount, there's a handful of like dependency work that has to go in order to be able to kind of like achieve these metrics. So for example, in order to be tracked something like an MQL, you need to have a clear understanding of the lifecycle stages and that to be codified inside your systems. Stage advancement criteria, lead scoring, lead routing, things like that. So like, if you're trying to get to this, make sure you have the dependency work done. And if you don't, you need to then kind of get there because that like, otherwise what we'll end up having is you'll have multiple individuals within your organization that have different definitions of, an MQL. And then you may get, the worst case scenarios, people roll in their board meeting. People are like, well, I thought it was 2 MQLs, and somebody else like, I thought it was 2,000 MQLs. So, James, while we're on the template, anything else you want to kind of highlight here? Like this, I know is kind of like a best-in-class starting place that you like to see, particularly from both the operator and the board perspective. Like, walk us through the template for 30 seconds, and we'll get back into the AI conversation.
I do not particularly like dashboards most of the time because I think they're too rigid and you have to create too many of them to see the full story half the time. So this is something that's evolved over the years for me. And I like to just be able to see everything in one pane of glass. Obviously, there's stuff that I'm not going to be able to find in this that I'll have to go into HubSpot or Salesforce to go get. But basically, it tells me most of the important metrics and how they're trending over time from like the very top of the funnel all the way through each opportunity stage in closed won. And what I like about this is it makes it really easy to adapt it on the fly. Like you just need to add a few more rows. If there's something you do or don't want to see, you don't need to spend a bunch of time building new stuff out in your CRM or your marketing automation platform. And it tracks things in just an incredibly easy to see way. And, what's the HubSpot report limit per dashboard? It's like 18 or something.
Yep.
you could never build something in another tool. Like maybe in Tableau you could kind of get here, but it would take a million lines of SQL to get something this good. And maybe I could do it pretty quickly now, but I think this is just the best way to see performance at a glance from not the 10,000 foot view, but maybe the 2,000 foot view.
And the cool part to the point that you're bringing up here, James, is like, you can be a Series A company and you don't need some super complex data warehouse and BI tool. Like you literally have a couple of key systems, add in coefficient, toss this all into a Google Sheet. And all of a sudden, like you have like a V1 of a data warehouse and BI tool here. Cool. I know we're going to get into a conversation about cohorted versus uncohorted. But while we're here, since we got it, what are your general thoughts on why do you like certain data to see cohorted and why do you like to see other data versus uncohorted?
Yeah, so if you scroll up to the opportunity stages, this doesn't always matter. And depending on how sort of static the changes in these metrics are month over month, maybe it does matter. And also it depends on how long your sales cycles are. So when we talk about cohorted versus uncohorted, I'm mostly talking about opportunity stages, and usually I do it off of opportunity creation. I'm a big proponent of auto creating stage 0 opportunities anytime a demo is booked. Or you could do demo attended if you have a low rate of attendance. But the uncohorted view versus the cohorted view, I like to be able to see in an ideal world where all of my pipeline from January 2025 is today. So if I'm in a 2-year sales cycle, it would be easy for me to see in column D what's the current status of all those things versus how far did things get at any given, or how far did all of the pipeline progress. So they both kind of answer different questions. Some may not matter as much for different businesses. So I think uncohorted is a fine starting point and cohorted is helpful, but probably not required.
In cohorted, to some of the comments you were making earlier, James, is like cohort is going to be more impactful as you have kind of like mid to longer sales cycles, things like that. And part of what it does is it highlights yellow flags of like, oh, hey, we had a bunch of like opportunities that are created in January, 2025 that are stuck here mid funnel, 12 months later. Why are they stuck? Was it something that, things like that, and creates that yellow flag where you can start to kind of like dive down further into.
And it's a really easy way to see if you have good hygiene or if your reps have good hygiene for close losing opportunities.
Yes, that is a phenomenal point. Like being able to kind of close loss that of like, yes, because otherwise you feel good about the pipeline and it's just it's actually not the actual indication of like how your actual pipeline is. So James, before we move off this, any other kind of thoughts, comments about kind of best in class reporting marketing metrics that you want to either look at as an operator or the board wants to take a look at?
No, I think it's, knowing the key ones, your win rate, your cost per opportunity, time to close, sales velocity, like those are the things that typically matter the most and are going to determine what you can invest and when you can expect to see a return. And if we see that there's high win rates in SMB and mid-market, but not enterprise, that indicates something. Obviously, you have to be a little bit careful about looking at win rates X number of days behind you if they haven't had time to mature compared to your typical average sales cycle length. But look for the patterns and understand, if win rates are 10% in a given segment, it probably does not warrant further GTM investment until product catches up.
One other call out here is you're putting all this together. I would strongly recommend, as you kind of identify, hey, this is the report we're going to use for win rate or close rate or ACV, standardizing, essentially stamping that report as this is the source of truth and communicating across the other key teams internally RevOps, sales, things like that. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to have sales come in and it's like, well, hang on a second. This is what we have for win rate. And this is, and now all of a sudden you're kind of in this conversation again. But to be able to kind of standardize the system and truth reporting.
The one caveat here, and I have been guilty of over-indexing on this in the past, and I don't want to go down a big attribution rabbit hole here, but to the extent possible, I also like to look at qualified pipeline per dollar invested as just, or you could do it the other way and look at dollars invested to qualified pipeline. I just like to see that on channel breakdown if possible, and it doesn't always make sense. And, you know, attribution is imprecise and imperfect, and hopefully your CEO and board understand that. But broadly speaking, if you do have some signal from like an opportunity source standpoint of just like, these are the channels, here's how much we're investing in them, here's how much opportunity pipeline we can drive to it. It's good to look at. I take it as directional, but I like looking at it that way.
Give us your, and again, I don't want to get wrapped around the axle, but give us your 30-second opinion about attribution. Like, how do you get something that's directionally correct that everybody can generally agree with?
Again, it depends on your sales cycle length. I think if you're doing enterprise, attribution is almost entirely useless, at least in the traditional sense, because there's so many confounding variables that trying to nail down one specific source as the converting factor is just not realistic. So that does require executive buy-in of saying like, hey, we're going to have a shared pipeline goal for sales, marketing, and BDRs. So I am a big fan of that. If you're going after a longer term sales cycle, saying, hey, we know that we're going to be working against this target account list as a team, and it would be extremely arbitrary to say that one thing generated this because they saw us at a conference 16 months ago. Our BDRs have been reaching out to them for 6 months. We invited them to a dinner. We sent them a sick ABM mailer, and then they came inbound to the website. Like, obviously, a lot of those things work together to generate the opportunity. So if you're doing enterprise, I would almost say like, don't bother investing a bunch of time in this. If it's more, you know, digital marketing driven or SEO driven, I think having a concept of an opportunity source, because everyone ingests a ton of leads into the CRM. And even if you're doing a good job of tracking where those came from, it's going to make reporting kind of a hassle. So I think having an opportunity source and having a RevOps team sort of be the arbiter of that can be helpful. And, you know, use the tool that you have. I think tools like Dreamdata and Hockey Stack can be helpful, but usually aren't worth the money. And you can generally just use some custom stuff in HubSpot to accomplish enough for it to be valuable. So I don't know. It's never going to be perfect. And I think the best thing you can do is just be consistent and make sure your head of finance, your CEO, and the board understand the limitations of attribution.
And along those lines, related but separate related, what's your kind of general opinion on influence pipeline versus directly sourced pipeline? Like, how valuable, and again, like, how does that impact kind of like decision making and things like that? Because one of our core beliefs, and I haven't said this out loud, but I say in a lot of other things, data is only valuable if you can make a decision from it, right? Looking at data for data's sake is just,
influence pipeline can be helpful if you have enough data. There's things like Markov chain analysis, which most of us probably don't have a large enough sample size to actually make use of, but that tests a little bit more for incrementality. Broadly speaking, I don't know. I just don't put much stock in influence pipeline, even though I know it's a very real thing. I believe that brand touches are incredibly important, especially in 2026. Performance marketing channels are way more expensive than ever. There's a gazillion SaaS tools. Like, brand is super important, and I think every touch point does have the potential to matter. but I don't think you're going to do yourself any favors by trying to index too heavily on influence pipeline. I think the better approach is to try and just think from first principles and talk to your CEO and your CFO and say, like, why did you buy QuickBooks? Why did you buy Salesforce? Like, it wasn't some particular touch. It's all of these touches that built up to a decision over time, and that's how everyone else buys for the most part. Not to say that some channels and touch points aren't more valuable, but you are never really going to know. And I think you can put a decent amount of weight on self-reported attribution. I think it is valuable to capture, especially if the sales rep asks it. So I always try to have whoever's doing the first call at a prospect ask how they heard about us. It has its own limitations, and I think it should be paired with whatever, if you're using Visible or HubSpot or whatever for actual click-based attribution. But it's also biased. So all of these things are directional, and the better route is to make sure that you're consistent and that everyone understands what you're actually using this for.
And I think your point right there, making sure you're consistent, everybody's on the same page, sounds like table stakes. You'd be surprised how many companies we see that it's not the case. So, all right, we've been saving the big conversation for last. This is the cliffhanger, right? Let's get back into the AI conversation. So, James, you roll into a net new organization. You can set up the tech stack however you want to set it up. What AI tools are you going to use? And then, what's one or two or three kind of AI workflow hacks you're using today that you're bam, people can go and do this tomorrow?
I am very firmly on the Claude Code train, and I think it's one of the most significant things I've ever seen happen in GTM. It's not going to be easy to get it to the point that you see the magic, but you have to push through a little bit of that discomfort. It's allowed me to do things, whether that's building websites, building landing pages, doing data science analysis with Python, analyzing things in Snowflake. I don't know how to write SQL, so pulling data directly from Snowflake to understand trends in a given market. There's a lot you can do with Claude Code, and the really nice thing about it is that it will teach you basically anything you need to do, and it will help you figure out. So treat it kind of like a both really smart and really dumb employee. If you're in plan mode and brainstorming, it can be a really smart employee if you tell it what outcome you're trying to drive towards. It can also be a really dumb employee, which can be a really good thing. If it's a dumb employee that learns really quickly, you can build skills or find skills that other people have built, and maybe you and your team do sort of an internal hackathon to define the best way to do a given workflow. The most powerful thing about Claude Code, and not to make this all about Claude Code, but it is infinitely flexible, and you can spin up simultaneous parallel agents to go accomplish things. So if you start out your day and just say go look at my Google Calendar, what's on my list of things to do. If you have Asana hooked up via MCP, just say, hey, here's the stuff I need to accomplish. Here's what my calendar looks like today. Help me get this stuff done. It can be a super valuable assistant in doing that. And there's a critically important thing here, which is setting up your context OS. So would highly recommend following a guy named Jacob Dietle. GJACOB-DIETLE. He has kind of open source something called a context OS. And fundamentally what it is, it's a way to define what's important to AI in Claude Code. And it's pretty easy to set up. You can ground it with all of your Gong conversations or Fathom or whatever you're using. And you define what's important to the AI, which is the important part. If you give it all this context about your ICP, your messaging, what your product does, who your competitors are, what customers are saying, what prospects are asking, AI can be way more powerful than you probably expected it to be. And this is something that's only been possible since mid-November when Opus 4.5 launched. So if you've previously had mediocre experiences, throw those out the window because everything has changed in the last few months. So back to your original question about tech stack, I don't think that much has changed. I think you still need a good CRM. You still need a good marketing automation platform set up. I think there are some interesting tools now like Fabby.ai, which is a kind of self-serve BI tool that's very AI native. Makes it really easy to do more complex analysis and hook up to a bunch of sources, and it will build dashboards and reporting for you in a way that was not super accessible before, and it works better than just native Claude or ChatGPT or whatever you're trying to do. Other than that, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of most of the AEO and GEO tools. I think a lot of them are overpriced and can give you false precision about how you're tracking in an LLM. That being said, it's something that your CEO and board is probably going to ask about, so it's probably worth signing up for one. It's a really fascinating space, and I think a lot of them are way overpriced, so I wouldn't pay more than $100 or $200 a month for it. Peak.ai, PEEC.ai is one I've used across the portfolio because it was Scrunch and Profound are good, but way overpriced in my opinion. They've raised a lot of money that makes it impossible for them to sell at what I consider to be an affordable rate. Other than that, I think good enrichment APIs are important. There's a new one called Prospeo, Prospeo, that was developed very heavily by a guy named Eric Nowoslawski, who is the largest Play user on Earth and sends over 100,000 cold emails a day. And Prospeo is really good because you can manipulate it primarily through Claude code, but also set up filters for enrichment through their UI. So if something doesn't look quite right, it's really easy for a non-technical person to go log in and change whatever filters. And even if you're not in a market that supports high volume cold outbound, I think this is an important skill for marketing RevOps to have because it will make you better at understanding your TAM, your SAM, your SOM, building target account lists, building segmented lists, understanding what trends you're seeing in different segments. So I think it's a valuable skill regardless of whether you're going to own, sending out cold email.
Cool. So if I'm to summarize this, right, if I'm a marketer here and I'm at a relatively early stage company, we got our CRM, we got a marketing automation platform, whatever it is, low hanging fruit. Because what's interesting is a number of the conversations we've had here internally at Domestique in the last, kid you not, in the last month is like, I feel like I'm having the same conversations. Get on a call with the CEO, like, hey, we bought a Claude code. What do I do next, right? So like have the marketing automation platform, your CRM, Claude code, and then potentially some sort of enrichment around Prospeo, Clay, things like that, reporting on the Fabby, and start to kind of take incremental steps on like initial kind of like automations, things like that. So or initial use cases, right? So one of the use cases you just kind of mentioned was understanding your TAM and doing a better job kind of segmenting, things like that. Any other kind of like crawl or walk version use cases as people are trying to get into this? And like, I think the point, you and I were talking about this yesterday before we prep for this, like one of the biggest issues we're seeing is like people's just hesitation of like, oh, I'm not a coder. How do I do this? How do I use a Claude code, or how do I use one of these native AI tools?
Yeah, I've never written a line of code. I'm not very smart, but you can literally just ask Claude to help you figure it out. It will do almost everything for you. It will help you figure anything out. If you just get past the discomfort of looking at the terminal in VS Code, which is what I would suggest, or you can use the Claude Code plugin within VS Code. I don't recommend only running Claude Code out of your native terminal or PowerShell on Mac or Windows, because you don't see the underlying file structure, which is what makes Claude Code super, super powerful and flexible. Brad Feld, I know some of you are Colorado people. Brad Feld, the founder of Foundry Group, a very famous VC, he's got a really interesting new blog where he talks about running a company on Markdown files. And he's been very heavy in the Cloud Code space recently. And I think it's a really interesting read about where things are going. There's a few people on LinkedIn that you should follow, like Jacob Dietl. But honestly, the best thing is just spend time in it. And I think things are going to go in this direction more and more. And building your tech stack around things that are manipulatable via MCP, command line interface, or API is going to be really important to future-proof things. I think generally speaking, you want to be purchasing tools that will not require you to log into some sort of UI to use. And for the marketing leaders and probably RevOps too, like, we are seeing a meaningful difference in hiring roadmap because companies are adopting Cloud Code in our portfolio. The scary thing that I'm seeing is that the CEOs are the people that are spending the most time in it, which I think bodes pretty poorly for a lot of the ICs and leaders in the business. If your CEO is doing some of this stuff and you're not, I think at some point they're going to get upset about that and look for someone who is able to just provide way more leverage. I'm not saying you don't need a marketing team or that, everyone is going to be displaced, but you can just get so much more done than you used to. Like, I come from a product marketing background. We used to require solutions marketing to spend a bunch of time to go spin up segmented messaging and positioning for different verticals and different company sizes and all these different flavors where, like, you need to have a good opinion on how your product should be communicated to different groups of people. And now it's really easy if you build a good context OS for AI to ingest all that information and make really good recommendations, especially if you have a large corpus of customer calls to ground it in. I think you can't outsource your thinking. The hardest thing to avoid and the biggest trap is expecting AI to think for you. And that's something that I still would not trust it to do, although it's getting better. And if you feed it lots of context, it will be closer, but you still can't outsource that part. But think about treating it like a team of, I used to say interns, now I would say like somewhere between entry level and pretty sophisticated employees, depending on the use case. So be clear about what outcome you're looking for, and it will take you most of the rest of the way.
James, this has been awesome, man. I do want to kind of give everybody an opportunity to kind of ask a couple questions the last couple of minutes. Any last 10-second, 30-second thoughts on AI as people are thinking about trying to step into this?
Just spend time in it. Anytime you're trying to do something, talk to Claude and see if it can do it. And it might not do it the first time, but you can probably get a lot closer, especially if you build out the skills that are going to be helpful. But I hate to sound so cliche, but you just need to be doing this or someone else will.
But, what's interesting is like the world that we all grew up in, right? The SaaS world for the last 10, 15 years. It was the same thing early on of like, you had to kind of figure that out as well. So. All right. Well, James, thank you so much for the conversation. Again, as I think everybody's acutely aware now, like, we think James is one of the smartest individuals in the space. And the cool part is he's got that kind of operator and board perspective. We got 3 minutes left for questions. What thoughts, comments, questions do people have? What we got here, James on the call.
To answer your question, Caleb, in the chat, he said, I've been using Cloud Code and VS Code tied into automation tools like n8n to actually run. I think, I've tested out using Cloud Code to generate n8n workflows via MCP or just copy and pasting the JSON in. Yeah. And it works okay, but one thing I had to keep doing is like scraping the updated documentation with new versions because Claude would try to write for nodes that don't exist or are named something different now. I think generally speaking, we will see a trend where AI is just interfacing via CLI or API, and you just don't really need to log into an interface as much. And I think what's really important is like there's a big opportunity to be early in that from a product standpoint, because Claude, here, let me see if I can dig up this article real quick. Claude will be more likely to pick you as a thing to recommend if you make it easy for Claude to understand what your product does and how it works. And if you can accomplish more via their API or CLI, then that's going to help your visibility in LLMs as well. So it's kind of a win-win.
Yeah. Part of the power that I've found with Claude, I mean, if what you're talking about too, though, is that you can tie it directly or give it access directly to Google Drive docs, for instance, which keeps it on path. You give it access to specifics about your company, it's going to output more accurately than if you're just trying to use it straight out of the box as well.
Yeah, Google unofficially just launched a command line interface for all of their sort of like Google Gmail, Calendar, Drive, Docs, Sheets. So what's cool now is you can hook up the CLI for Google, and I created a skill for it to output a pretty nice looking Google Docs document. And that's made it really easy for me to like take some sort of output and put it into a format that is, you know, manipulatable and has collaborative access and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can do cool stuff like go back through all my emails, and you can kind of do this just with Gemini built into Gmail too, but go pull stuff out of my emails, go find stuff, tell me what's going on in my calendar, like create a new sheet, reconfigure my folder structure for Google Drive. Like you can just do all of that through Claude Code now, which is really nice.
Yeah, they just released their new model that can tie directly to it has a more powerful RAG setup from what I understand too. So I think it just came out within the last like yesterday or something. So I have to research it more, but I mean, no doubt. I just wanted to touch on that and get your opinion on utilizing Claude in that way, since you're such a large proponent of it. But it's just going to continue to get more and more powerful. But a huge thing, like you said before too, aside Claude, you can actually set it to the teaching or the learning settings. So when individuals, anybody who's not familiar with it, when you're going through it, it will walk you through step by step, as James had said, exactly how to learn the process and get more comfortable with it.
It's really addicting.
Yeah, it really is.
Well, I know we're at the top of the hour. James, this has been incredible. This has been awesome. I know we may or may not have gotten to all the questions. Caleb, that was an awesome question. Thank you, sir. Always appreciate the kind of insights. If anybody has any additional questions, feel free to reach out. We're obviously going to send a follow-up, and the follow-up will include some of the links to some of the things that we referenced and chatted about, but we're always happy to kind of jump on a call and things like that. But James, thank you so much, sir. Truly appreciate the time today. And everybody, thank you for taking the time to spend your lunchtime with us, and hope everybody has an absolutely wonderful rest of your day.